Hi, everyone. You ever notice how we always have somewhere we have to be, whether it be school, work, or social events? And we have tools like timers, calendars, day planners, all that tell us where we have to be and when. Of course, sometimes we actually look forward to those appointments, whether it be like a game night or maybe we're having lunch with some friends. But for the members of the West End Baptist Church, it was their weekly choir practice every Wednesday at exactly 7:25 p.m. But on one particular Wednesday night in March of 1950, the whole choir would become the subject of an apparent miracle. Today's story, as unbelievable as it may seem, actually really did happen to the choir of West End Baptist Church. Our story today takes place in Beatrice, Nebraska. It was March of 1950 and it was bitterly cold. Martha Paul is the director for the West End Baptist Church, and at that time she had been acting as director for 30 years already. She was known for her really strict punctuality. All the choir members were expected to show up no later than 7:25 p.m. on the dot. And the members usually did follow Martha's rule, usually arriving around 10 minutes before practice would start. Martha's daughter, Marilyn, was also in the choir, and she would later recount that no one was ever really late, except for very few times, but mostly everyone was there on time. But little did they know, their weekly choir practice on February 22nd would turn out to be their last practice in the West End Baptist Church, because on the following Wednesday, March 1st, their practice night would turn out to be very different. On the afternoon of March 1st, it was bitterly cold outside. So the Reverend Walter Klempel would actually stop by the church around 4:30 in the afternoon to light the furnace so that the church would be warm in time for their choir practice that night. Then the Reverend would return home to have dinner with his wife and young daughter. And just as they always did, the Reverend and his wife, after finishing up dinner, they would help prepare their daughter to bring her with them to their weekly choir practice. But that particular Wednesday night, the Klempels would be delayed because their young daughter had actually soiled her dress during dinner time. And so Mrs. Klempel, Eunice, would have to go fetch a new dress and iron it for her. Meanwhile, over at Martha's house, remember Martha, the choir director? Well, her daughter Marilyn was fast asleep. Marilyn had actually planned on leaving about half an hour early that day, but after dinner she felt tired, and so she decided she would take a 15-minute nap. But that nap turned out to be more like half an hour. So when her mother Martha went to wake her up, her father said to just let their daughter have some rest. So Marilyn would actually end up waking up around 7:15 p.m. By that time, there was no way that Martha and Marilyn could get to choir practice on time. At the same time, in another part of town, choir member Herbert Kiff was really concentrating on writing a letter for some church business. And Herbert's mother was actually hounding him to get going because he was already running late. Herbert couldn't explain it. He just had this feeling that he had to get that letter done that night so that he could drop it off in the mailbox on the way to choir practice. Meanwhile, another choir member, Lucille Jones, was actually just chilling out at her home. At around 7 p.m., she would turn on her radio to listen to This Is Your Life, which documents famous people's lives. And the show normally ran until around 7:30. Lucille figured that she would only listen to part of the program so that she could leave and get to choir practice on time. And later on, Lucille would actually recount that she didn't know why she would turn on the radio that night. But when she heard that the show would be covering one of her favorite actors, Edgar Bergen, she decided to stay to listen till the end. And it would turn out that Lucille actually lived next door to another choir member, Dorothy Wood. And they were supposed to drive to choir practice together. However, that night Lucille was absolutely entranced by her radio show, and she completely forgot about choir practice. So she would end up holding up both herself and Dorothy from getting to choir practice on time that night. Around that time, in another part of town, 15-year-old LaDonna Vandegrift was actually doing home math homework. She usually arrived to choir practice early, but she didn't care if she was late that night. She had a particular geometry problem that she just couldn't solve, and she was set on getting it solved before she would go out to choir practice. In the meantime, a couple miles away, Royina Estes was having trouble starting her car. Her car hadn't had any problems before that. It just all of a sudden couldn't start. And in fact, Royina was supposed to pick up her sister Sadie, who's also in a choir, to go to practice together. So both Royina and Sadie were going to be late to practice if they couldn't hitch a ride. So they called LaDonna to pick them up, but if you remember, LaDonna was still dead set on getting her math homework done. And on the other side of town, Ruth Schuster and her daughter Susan were helping Ruth's mom prepare their house for a missionary meeting. Usually, both Ruth and Susan would arrive to choir practice around 7:20 p.m., but on that night, they were so preoccupied with helping their mom prepare her house for the missionary meeting that they totally forgot and lost track of time. And Ruth's brother, Harvey All, was also in the choir. And that night, he had been taking care of their two sons while his wife was away. Harvey was actually planning on taking his two sons to choir practice with him that night, but as him and his two sons were just chatting up a storm, he actually lost track of time. By the time he actually looked at his watch, he realized that he was already late. Meanwhile, just across the street from the church lived choir member Joyce Black. Joyce would later recall that that night she was ready for practice, but she just couldn't get off the couch. I mean, you have to remember, it's freezing cold that day in March. And Joyce just outright admitted that she was just plain lazy and she just didn't want to get off her nice warm couch and go into the cold night air. I mean, who would? So Joyce ended up staying in a little while longer. And when Joyce finally did get up off her couch to go put on her coat to leave, she stepped out her front door at around 7:27 p.m., just as the church across the street exploded. I mean, it was like a bomb exploded. The church shattered and pieces were flying in all directions. The walls of the church fell outward and the heavy wooden roof fell down to the ground. In fact, the explosion was so strong that the church steeple would later be found on another street nearby. And many residents said that they heard and felt trembles from the explosion. The explosion had caused lights to go out all over the city, and the windows of the houses across the street actually shattered. And for a while, the town's radio station actually went off the air. And remember choir director Martha and her daughter Marilyn? Well, they later recalled that they were just stepping out their front door when the explosion actually shook their house. And Marilyn said it sounded like a big bomb had gone off. And Joyce, who lived across the street, she said that she saw their songbooks and sheet music all flying around through the air. And one of the songbooks actually fell right by her feet in mint condition, so she decided to keep it. Firefighters would arrive shortly after to put out the blazing fire, and the choir members would start arriving at the scene one by one. As each one arrived, they thought that the other choir members were inside, hurt or maybe actually dead. And as each of the choir members arrived, they were frantically trying to search the rubble for their missing choir members who hadn't been accounted for yet. But then the remaining church members started arriving one by one, each with their very own reason for being late, until it would turn out that all 15 members had been accounted for. And when they all realized that the whole choir was safe and no one had been in the church when it exploded, they all took each other's hands to give thanks to God for being spared. And if you remember Herbert, the one who was late because he was writing a letter for some church business, he would go on to say that the strangeness of the events that night could be considered a coincidence if it had been like a busload of people who all got delayed because of a flat tire or something. But to have 15 different people all scattered around the town, each having their very own trivial reason for being late, there has to be something more to it. And Lucille, the one who had been listening to that radio show called This Is Your Life, actually said that if she hadn't been listening to This Is Your Life, it could have been her life that would have ended that night. And also Marilyn, Martha's daughter, would actually go on to say that she felt that maybe God didn't want them in that church that night. And as for the cause of that explosion, well, investigations would later point to a leak in the natural gas pipeline that was underground. When the natural gas leak reached the fire that was burning in the furnace, it caused that kabloom explosion. And in fact, if the church choir members had been there that night, their pew where they usually practice would have been exactly above the furnace. It would have been a tragedy. Someone later calculated the odds that all 15 members would be late on that one night, and it turns out that there is a 1 in a million chance. So the West End Baptist Church would later be rebuilt later on, but until today, the members of the town of Beatrice, Nebraska, they still wonder about the strangeness of the events that night. I mean, 15 choir members all late on the same night. Could it be coincidence? Or maybe it was something more than that? I want to know what you think of the story of the choir who escaped certain tragedy. Do you think that it was merely a coincidence that every member of the choir was saved that night? Or maybe it was the careful design of a greater power trying to protect the choir? So let me know in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories that prove that sometimes fact can be stranger than fiction, then please like and subscribe for more. Thank you and have a great week, everyone.